Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about resumable online indexes inside of SQL Server. Now, resumable online indexes rebuild was introduced in SQL 2017, and in 2019 that feature has been extended to the create statement as well. But before we dive deep into that aspect of resumable indexes, I figured it would be a good time to just review the basics about indexes per se. Now, online indexes were introduced way back in SQL 2005 and pertain mainly to the clustered and non-clustered indexes. The problem that DBAs faced was that an online index would require the DBA to go ahead and commit a significant amount of resources in order for the index to be online. Naturally, an offline index, because of the fact that there were no locking and blocking issues, was significantly faster. So the DBA was left with the choice of either bringing the table offline, reducing the availability of the table to end users, or committing an extra amount of resources so that users can continue to query while the index rebuild operation completed. However, the challenge that they faced was as tables kept increasing, the time taken for index rebuilds also increased, and they were committed to sticking with the rebuild operation no matter how long it took. Naturally, this is not really a good place to be for DBAs because they need to be able to understand and control the behavior of SQL Server, especially in times when there's massive amount of resource consumption, such as a clustered index rebuild. Sure, Microsoft went ahead and introduced a couple of features like being able to rebuild partitions and also manage log priority, which prevented an index rebuild operation from starting until everything was perfectly in place. This didn't really solve the issue, it just was a workaround for the DBA because once a DBA started the rebuild operation, he was still committed to seeing it through. It wasn't like he could interfere in the middle of the process and kind of get back control of the server. And that is what Microsoft is addressing with the resumable indexes that we are seeing now inside SQL Server 2017 and 2019. So the idea is that from 2017 onwards, Microsoft gave us the ability to rebuild an index. Note, it's a rebuild, it's not a create statement. So you already had an index, and then when you rebuild it, you have the ability to pause it, abort, or resume it as you see fit. However, that particular functionality has also been extended to the create statement now in SQL 2019, so that you can go ahead and even pause an index that is just being created. Now you might ask yourself, why does it matter if we can pause a create statement? Because essentially a create is just a one-time activity. However, having said that, there are a lot of scenarios where you would drop an index, load some data, and then recreate the index. And that's where this functionality really shines because it allows you to go ahead and control the behavior in a much more granular way. There are some DMVs and there are some commands that you will see later on in this video, such as sys.index_resumable operations, which gives you a percentage progress of the index rebuild operation. So as a DBA, what you would want to do from now on is start the index rebuild operation in a resumable state, query this DMV to see how far along it is, and then decide if you want to pause it, abort it, or resume it as needed. So let's go ahead and look at some of the details. There are obviously some other things I want to show you later on as database scope credentials that allow you to set the default values by default. And in the last slide here, I've just gone ahead and shown you all the different types of indexes that we have inside SQL Server when they were introduced, and the ones that we're going to talk about today is clustered and non-clustered indexes with rebuild and then create being supported as resumable operations. Inside my SQL Server, I've already gone ahead and created a database, created a table, and loaded about 3 million rows into the table, which is what you're seeing here. The first step I want to show you is the rebuild operation. So I'm going to create a clustered index, as you can see here, without any resumable operations, as you might see later on. So when I run this, it's going to take about a minute for this operation to complete. So I'll go ahead and pause the video at this point while the index is being created. And once the index is created, I'm going to initiate a rebuild operation where I specify that this rebuild operation is a resumable operation with a maximum duration of 1 minute, which means that it either completes the entire rebuild within a minute or defaults to a pause state after that execution time of 1 minute. A standard syntax for this kind of scenario would be sort and tempdb should be off, online should naturally be on, so that resumable can take effect. So these are some of the standard stuff that you want to see being implemented by default. Sort and temp DB off, online on, resumable on. Max duration obviously depends on your maintenance window and your own benchmark about how long you think certain indexes should take. The idea being that once the clustered index rebuild create statement is complete, when I run this, I'll just keep it running for about a minute, and once that 1 minute duration is complete, it's not perfectly 1 minute, but yeah, there is some amount of delay in the process, and around 1 minute it's gonna go ahead and stop. And when it does that, what we'll see is if we query the DMV that I mentioned before, we'll see that it's in a pause state as a result of the operation having to be stopped at that particular point. And naturally the next step would be then for me to resume the operation. And you can also see we can manually pause it, but I would rather you first see this operation of how SQL Server would automatically pause it on your behalf, and then maybe show you a demonstration of how you could manually get into the whole process and pause it based on what you think might be a more higher priority task. So let me go ahead, pause the video, and I'll come back once the index has been created. Okay, great. So the index has been created, and what we're going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and try to rebuild this index using this 1 minute duration. Now I could go ahead and simply come and run this particular query here, but I'm not going to do that right now because I want to show you how SQL Server automatically handles that behavior for us by looking at the max duration. Just for your information, max duration is something that was introduced in SQL 2019, as in it's going to be introduced in 2019. So this is something that you might find useful going forward. Again, we've got about a minute to wait, so I'm going to pause the video, and when I come back you're going to see that the query is going to throw a couple of errors explaining that the operation had to be closed because it exceeded the specified duration of 1 minute and the transaction has been killed. However, you'll notice that when I say kill, I don't necessarily mean killed and rolled back. It just means that it's killed in the context of the transaction having been paused. And we'll see that when I run the DMV over here and show you the status of this index rebuild operation as being paused. So let me just go ahead and pause this video while that's happening. Oh well, great, I didn't need to go ahead and pause it. As you can see here, I've got the error message saying that it waited about a minute. It did maybe some amount of operations, but it couldn't complete it, so it's now killed my particular session. So the best way for me to figure out whether things are done or incomplete is by running select star from sys.index_resumable operations. When I do that, you'll see that my alter index statement for the rebuild is what I see here under SQL text, but more importantly you'll see that the state description says paused. And the fact is that I actually have completed about 98% of the index rebuild operation. So if I had just gone ahead and increased the max duration, I wouldn't get that error message and everything would have completed smoothly. However, at this point, the bottom line is I waited a minute, index rebuild didn't complete, and it's paused. And I figure that, well, it's about 98% complete, so I just want to go ahead and resume it so that it'll finish what it was doing. In order to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and run this statement here where you can see it says pause. I'm just going to replace that with resume and say finish what you were doing. And once that's done, you'll see that there's the 98% is complete. And if I run this now, there are no more operations that are stuck in any transient state. They're all completed and my index is rebuilt. And this is the advantage that you will get with resumable indexes, where you can specify when it needs to cut off. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look at how this behaves for the create statement. Just for your information, this is exactly the same behavior whether you use a clustered or a non-clustered index. The commands are the same naturally, except for the create statement, which would be create non-clustered index. The rest of it remains exactly the same. So let's go ahead and start talking about the create statement with the context of SQL 2019. So in 2019 you'll see that I'm not using a rebuild, I'm using a create statement. So once again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and drop the index that I created previously on the table, And now that the index is created, I'm going to go ahead and create a clustered index, and this time you'll notice that I'm actually specifying resumable equals to on, max duration equals to 1, etc, etc, online, etc. And again, statistics recompute not necessarily required in this case. I was checking something else out, so I was running that. But let's go ahead and run this guy now. And what you'll see here is that this particular state right now, it is creating the index for me. And like I mentioned earlier, you can, as a DBA, now interfere with the process by going ahead and executing a command like this and essentially saying that I need SQL Server to stop the index creation statement or pause it basically until I maybe free up some disk space or some other activity. Just so you can see, if I run this command right now, you'll see that my index create statement is about 57% complete. So I'm going to pause this guy right now. And let's just wait a second while it actually does the operation. This is not exactly real time. There are operations happening in the background. Locks need to be released, etc. So just give it a minute while that's happening. And once that's done, we'll see that the create statement in itself is being paused. Okay, so the pause command has finished executing. You'll see that now I get a different error message which says that it was disconnected because a high priority DDL operation was executed. Essentially, some other transaction, some other command from another session caused this particular transaction of creating an index to be stopped. At this point, if I go ahead and query this particular DMV, you'll see that I've got my clustered index create statement in a pause state. And this is what's new in 2019. So I could probably come over here right now and tell SQL Server to abort the transaction and just release all the resources that it had blocked, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to go ahead and tell it to resume the operation. So I'll come and say alter index da 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 on table and then resume. So just go ahead and press that. Now while that's happening, let me explain to you what we have here in terms of alter database scope credentials. Now what we're doing here is, again, you can see that there are some new syntax changes to the create statement for index rebuilds as well as index creates. And what you can do is you can default the behavior to elevate existing queries, existing DDL statements for index create and index rebuild to automatically behave as online and resumable by default. So the idea being that you might have a traditional script where you might not have mentioned online equal to on or resumable equal to on, and you don't want to go ahead and change each and every script that you have. Instead, you can default the database to treat all index rebuild and all index create statements to be automatically as online and resumable by default. And that's what when supported over here means. This particular credential basically supports three different states. The first one being off, where everything is set to off and things behave just like you normally are used to. The second one is when supported, where if the statement supports a syntax for online or resumable, then at that point it will automatically be treated as online or resumable. Anything that doesn't support online or resumable continues to behave as offline and non-resumable. The third option that you have is fail unsupported, in which case what happens is anything that can be treated as online resumable will be treated as online and resumable. Anything that cannot be treated as online and resumable will fail and throw an error message. So you want to go ahead and explore that a little bit more to understand in which scenarios you would prefer to have a failure and in which scenarios you would prefer things to just be offline. Naturally, this affects the ability to query tables because of the fact that it has to be online. So this is something that you want to pay close attention to. And that's really all there is to it. So as you can see, my index is being resumed from the previous past state, and once it's complete, if I run this particular command, it should go ahead and tell me that the index rebuild is complete. And we'll just have to wait a couple of minutes for that to finish. So I'll just run this query here to see if I can show you what the state of the index is right now. So it's at 71%. And what I'm going to do is, if I just keep running this, you'll see that it's in currently running state, so it's 71, 80%. A few more seconds, and I guess the index rebuild should be complete. And that's really all there is to it as far as being able to pause, abort, or resume an index rebuild or an index create statement is concerned. And I really think that this would be one of those features that DBA should definitely be using, because it can give you a lot more control over your maintenance window, and it can definitely make your life a whole lot easier with regard to performance tuning issues, etc., where especially for very large tables, you're always under pressure to go ahead and deliver results immediately, and at the same time having to make sure that existing functionality and features don't break. Well, so as you can see, it's finished executing. So if I run this now, you'll see that there's no pending transactions left that need to be completed. And that's just about it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've got a good understanding and appreciation for what online and resumable indexes can do for you, especially with regard to rebuild and create inside SQL 2017 and 2019. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.